It was a cold Saturday morning in Vermont when Margaret opened her curtains and watched the snow fall quietly over the pine trees. The world outside looked peaceful, blanketed in white, but her heart felt restless. It had been years since her family last gathered at her cabin. Her son David lived in Boston with his wife, and her grandson Ethan was growing up faster than she could keep up with. Every year she promised herself to visit more often. And every year she found another excuse to stay home. Too cold, too far, too old. But this time was different. Her birthday was coming, and David insisted they spend the weekend together. "Ethan wants to see you, Mom," he'd said over the phone. "He misses your stories." That sentence alone had melted her heart. By noon, the sound of tires crunching through snow filled the driveway. Margaret hurried to open the door. David stepped out first, his arms full of bags, his hair sprinkled with snowflakes. Behind him came Ethan, 12 years old, his cheeks red from the cold, his blue eyes bright like his grandfather's once were. He ran to her, hugging her tightly. "Grandma?" he said, muffled against her sweater. "I brought you something." Margaret laughed, brushing his hair from his forehead. "What could it be this time?" "Another drawing of your famous dragon." He grinned. "Better. You'll see later." The cabin filled with warmth, not just from the fire crackling in the hearth, but from laughter. The sound of family that had been missing for so long. Margaret cooked her son's favorite stew, the same recipe his father used to love, while Ethan helped her slice vegetables. "You're getting good at this," she said, watching his careful hands. "Mom makes me help every Sunday," he said proudly. "She says it's so I can cook for someone special one day." Margaret smiled softly. "Smart woman. Keep that up." That evening, as snow piled high outside, they gathered near the fire. David sat quietly, lost in his thoughts, while Ethan played with the wooden train set Margaret had kept from his father's childhood. It was an ordinary evening, cozy, calm, full of small talk and soft laughter. But beneath it, something unspoken hung in the air. Margaret noticed it in her son's eyes, that tired, heavy look that didn't match the warmth of the fire. Later, when Ethan had gone to bed, she sat beside David and handed him a cup of tea. "What's wrong, dear?" she asked gently. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Work, Mom. Always work. And things at home." She frowned. "You and Rachel." He nodded slowly. "She's been distant. We barely talk these days. I don't even know if she's happy anymore." Margaret reached for his hand. "Marriage isn't easy, David, but love, real love, it's worth fighting for." He smiled faintly. I know. But sometimes it feels like we're just two people living under the same roof." The sadness in his voice pierced her. She remembered the same tone in her late husband's voice years ago, when life's responsibilities had pushed them apart for a while. "Don't give up on her," she said softly. "People lose their way sometimes, but love can find them again." He nodded, though his eyes didn't lift from the fire. The next morning, Ethan was up early, excited about something. He kept whispering to himself, sneaking glances toward the door. "What are you up to, young man?" Margaret teased. "You'll see, Grandma," he said, running to grab his jacket. "Dad, can we go outside for a bit?" David hesitated, but agreed. "Don't go far," Margaret called after them. She watched through the window as they disappeared into the snowy woods behind the cabin. For a while, everything was quiet. She sat in her rocking chair, sipping coffee, lost in thought. The wind whistled softly through the chimney, and she felt a strange mix of peace and loneliness. Then, almost an hour later, she heard the door open. Ethan burst in, his cheeks flushed, his hair messy from the cold. "Grandma, come outside," he shouted. "You have to see." She followed him out, pulling her shawl tight around her shoulders, in the backyard. In the middle of the snowy clearing stood something that made her gasp. A small wooden birdhouse, freshly painted, hung from the old oak tree, the one her husband had planted decades ago. On the side, written in uneven blue letters, were the words, "For Grandma, so Grandpa can visit too." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "Ethan, did you make this?" she whispered. He nodded proudly. "Dad helped a little." I know you miss Grandpa, and I thought maybe the birds could bring him messages." She pressed her trembling hand against her lips. "Oh, sweetheart." David stepped closer, his own eyes moist. "It was his idea, Mom. He said he wanted to make you smile again." For a moment, Margaret couldn't speak. The cold air stung her cheeks, but it wasn't the weather that made her shiver. It was the warmth of that gesture, the pure Yuzuror, innocent love of a child who somehow understood what adults often forget. Later that day, they sat together by the window watching birds already pecking at the new house. "See, Grandma," Ethan said softly. "He's here now." Margaret wrapped her arm around him. "Maybe he is," she whispered. But just as the warmth of that moment settled in, Ethan turned to her and said something that caught her completely off guard. His voice was calm, almost too calm for his age. "Grandma, can I tell you a secret? Promise you won't tell Dad." She hesitated, her heart skipping a beat. "Of course, honey. You can tell me anything." He looked down at his hands, fidgeting. "Mom said she might not come home for a while." Margaret blinked, unsure she'd heard right. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Ethan's eyes welled up. "She said she needs time to think. She told me not to tell Dad because she doesn't want him to be sad." The words hit Margaret like a sudden chill. For a second, she didn't know how to respond. David had said things were distant, but this was something else. She held Ethan close, her heart pounding. "You did the right thing telling me, sweetheart," she whispered. "Everything will be okay." When David came back inside, his mother's eyes followed him silently. She wanted to tell him right away, but stopped herself. Ethan's little face looked so worried that she couldn't break that fragile trust. That night, as the cabin lights dimmed and the world outside fell quiet, Margaret sat awake in her chair, staring into the fire. The words kept echoing in her mind. She might not come home for a while. Her hands trembled as she picked up the old photo on the mantel, one of her and her husband taken in that very spot years ago. She closed her eyes, whispering to the flames, "What would you tell me to do, John?" The fire cracked softly, as if answering her with silence. Outside, the wind grew stronger, and the shadows danced on the walls. She looked toward Ethan's room, where his small nightlight glowed. She thought about her son, unaware of the storm quietly building around his family. The peaceful weekend she had imagined now felt heavy with secrets. She knew the next day would bring decisions she wasn't ready for. But she also knew one thing: love, no matter how complicated, was worth fighting for. As she finally drifted to sleep, the sound of the wind outside almost sounded like a whisper, gentle, familiar, like the echo of her late husband's voice. "Be strong, Maggie," it seemed to say. And though she didn't know it yet, Ethan's little secret would change all their lives in ways none of them could have imagined. The next morning, the sun peeked through the curtains, casting soft golden light over the cabin. Margaret woke early, though she hadn't slept much. The words Ethan had told her the night before stayed in her mind, circling like a storm she couldn't escape. Mom said she might not come home for a while. She quietly walked into the kitchen, careful not to wake the others, and started brewing coffee. The smell filled the room, warm and comforting. But her thoughts were far from calm. When David came downstairs, rubbing his eyes, she smiled faintly. "Morning, dear. Sleep well?" she asked, trying to sound normal. He nodded. "Better than I expected." Ethan was out like a light. She watched him for a moment, the way he avoided eye contact, the heaviness in his shoulders. She could tell his mind was somewhere else. After breakfast, David announced that he had to take a quick call for work. "Just a few minutes," he said, stepping outside with his phone. Margaret turned to Ethan, who was quietly building a small fort with pillows. "Sweetheart," she said softly, sitting beside him. "When your mom said she needed time, did she tell you where she was going?" Ethan shook his head. "She just said she had to think about things." "Think she's sad, Grandma?" That word "sad" landed heavily in her chest. Margaret knew that kind of sadness. She had seen it before in herself, years ago after her husband's death. The emptiness that makes you question everything, even love. She brushed Ethan's hair gently. sometimes grown-ups get lost in their feelings, she said. But it doesn't mean they stop loving you. Ethan nodded quietly, his little face serious. Later that day, David came back in, his expression distant. "You okay, son?" Margaret asked, handing him a mug of coffee. He sighed. "Yeah, just work things." But she could tell he was lying the way he said it too quickly, the way his eyes shifted away. As the afternoon sun began to fade, Margaret decided to take a walk with Ethan. They followed a narrow trail behind the cabin, their boots crunching softly through the snow. "You know," she said, "your dad used to come here when he was your age. He built forts just like this one." Ethan smiled. "Did Grandpa help him?" She nodded. "Always. They'd spend hours out here." They reached the frozen lake at the edge of the woods. Surface glistened under the fading sunlight. Ethan threw a snowball across it, laughing when it slid far. "Grandma," he said suddenly, "do you think my parents will get a divorce?" The question hit her like a sudden gust of cold wind. She stopped walking, her heart aching. "Why do you ask that?" she managed to say. Ethan shrugged, his little face serious. "Kids at school talk about it when their parents fight. Mom and Dad don't fight loud, but they don't smile much anymore." He looked up at her with those bright blue eyes, so much like his father's once were, searching for an answer. Margaret knelt down beside him. "Ethan," she said gently, "sometimes grown-ups forget how to talk when they're hurting. But love doesn't just disappear. Your mom and dad both love you more than anything. That's something that will never change." He nodded, though he didn't look convinced. As they headed back, Margaret felt the weight of that question settle in her bones. She knew she couldn't keep the secret any longer. David deserved to know the truth, even if it hurt him. That evening after dinner, when Ethan went upstairs to read, she finally spoke. "David," she began, her voice calm but firm, "there's something you should know." He looked up, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What is it, Mom?" She hesitated. "Ethan told me something last night. He said Rachel might not come home for a while." His face went pale. "What?" She continued softly. "He said she told him she needed time to think. She didn't want him to tell you." David sat back, running his hands through his hair. His voice cracked slightly. "I knew something was wrong, but I didn't think it was this bad." Margaret reached out and held his hand. "I'm sorry, dear. Didn't want to upset you, but you deserve to know." For a long time, he said nothing. The fire crackled quietly between them. Finally, he spoke. "She's been distant for months. Always busy, always tired. I asked if something was wrong, but she just said she needed space. I thought it was work stress. I guess I was wrong." Margaret's heart ached for her son. "Maybe she just needs a break to remember what matters," she said softly. "Sometimes, when people lose themselves, distance helps them see clearer." David looked up, his eyes red. "No, Mom? What if she's done with me? What if this is her way of saying goodbye?" Margaret shook her head gently. "Don't decide that yet. Let her speak for herself. Love doesn't end quietly. It asks for understanding first." Later that night, when the house fell silent, David sat alone by the window. Snowflakes drifted slowly outside, catching in the lamplight. He picked up his phone, scrolling through old pictures. Rachel smiling at their wedding, her hand in his, Ethan as a baby in her arms. So much time, so much love. Where had it gone? He typed a message. "I hope you're okay. Ethan misses you." "I miss you too." Then he hesitated. His thumb hovered over the send button. Finally, he pressed it and set the phone down. In her room, Margaret lay awake, listening to the soft ticking of the clock. She knew love could survive storms, but only if both hearts wanted to rebuild. She prayed silently, not just for David and Rachel, but for little Ethan, who was old enough to see the cracks yet too young to understand them. The next morning brought a quiet peace. The sky was clear, the snow glittering like diamonds. Ethan was cheerful again, building snowmen outside. David joined him, trying to smile, trying to forget for a moment. Margaret watched from the porch, her heart heavy yet hopeful. Then something unexpected happened. David's phone buzzed, picked it up, and froze. "It's Rachel," he said quietly. Margaret's heart skipped. What did she say? He opened the message slowly, reading it aloud. "I'm sorry for disappearing. I just needed space to think. I'll come by the cabin tonight. We need to talk." For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the wind, whispering through the trees. Ethan looked up from his snowman. "Is Mom coming?" he asked eagerly. David smiled weakly. Buddy, she's coming." Margaret felt her pulse quicken. She didn't know whether to feel relief or worry. That night would change everything one way or another. As dusk settled, she prepared dinner, her hands trembling slightly. The cabin felt alive with anticipation. Every creak, every sound from outside made them turn their heads. Then, finally, headlights appeared through the trees. Rachel stepped out of the car slowly. She looked tired, her face pale, but her eyes soft when she saw Ethan running toward her mom. He cried, wrapping his arms around her. She held him tightly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I missed you so much," she whispered. David stood by the door, uncertain, his heart caught between anger and love. When Rachel finally looked at him, silence filled the space between them. Then she said quietly, "Can we talk?" They sat by the fire after Ethan went to bed. Margaret stayed in the kitchen, giving them space. Though she could hear parts of their voices, soft, trembling, breaking, mending, Rachel's voice wavered. "I didn't leave because of you. I left because of me. I forgot who I was somewhere along the way. Between work, motherhood, and everything, I lost myself. And I was scared to tell you because I didn't want to disappoint you." David's voice was steady but full of emotion. "She didn't disappoint me. I just thought you didn't love me anymore." Her eyes filled with tears. "I do. I just needed to remember how to love myself, too." Margaret stood quietly by the kitchen door, tears in her own eyes. The honesty, the vulnerability, it reminded her so much of her own marriage. Oh, love isn't perfect, but it survives when people choose to face the pain instead of running from it. When the fire burned low and the night grew silent, Rachel reached for David's hand. "I want to come home," she whispered. "You'll have me." David didn't speak. He just held her hand tighter. From the stairs, Ethan peeked down quietly, smiling through sleepy eyes. He didn't know all the words they'd said, but he could feel the warmth in the air again, the peace he'd been missing. Margaret watched the three of them as the flames flickered low. For the first time in years, she felt a sense of wholeness in her home again. But deep inside, she knew this wasn't just a reunion. It was the beginning of something new. It's a quiet promise that love, no matter how lost, can always find its way back. The morning after Rachel returned to the cabin, the air felt lighter, not entirely healed, but no longer heavy with silence. Margaret woke early, stepping quietly into the living room. The fire from last night had turned to soft ashes, still warm. On the couch, Rachel and David had fallen asleep next to each other. Not holding hands, but close enough that it meant something. For the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself to breathe fully. Ethan was still asleep upstairs, his little snores barely audible. Margaret poured herself coffee and stood by the window, looking out at the snowy woods. The sky was painted pink and gold, the kind of sunrise that whispered hope. Yet beneath that peace, her mind kept circling back to what had happened. Rachel's return was a start, but she could see how fragile everything still was. When Rachel woke, she looked disoriented, blinking as if remembering where she was. Margaret smiled softly. "Morning, dear. How did you sleep?" Rachel hesitated, then smiled back faintly. "Better than I expected." David stirred beside her, rubbing his eyes, and for a brief moment, their gazes met, full of quiet understanding. Not yet love, but a step toward it. Over breakfast, Ethan came bounding down the stairs, his energy filling the room. "Mom, you're still here," he said, running into her arms. Rachel hugged him tightly, tears glistening in her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, sweetheart." The boys' laughter filled the cabin, and for the first time in days, everyone smiled genuinely. Later that afternoon, they decided to go for a walk together. The woods looked magical after last night's snow, white, untouched, peaceful. Ethan ran ahead, his boots crunching through the snow. "Careful," David called, his tone soft but protective. Rachel slipped her gloved hand into David's, almost shyly. He didn't pull away. Margaret walked a few steps behind, pretending not to notice, but smiling quietly as they reached the frozen lake again. Ethan sat down on a fallen log, catching his breath. He looked up at the sky and said, "You know, Grandma, last night I dreamed that Grandpa came to see me." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "You did?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded. "He told me not to worry anymore. He said everything was going to be okay." His words were simple, but they struck deep. Margaret felt tears well in her eyes. She had always believed her late husband still watched over them somehow. And now, hearing Ethan's dream, she felt that connection again. Rachel looked at Margaret with quiet awe. "He dreamed about your husband?" she asked softly. Margaret nodded. "Yes, maybe it was his way of telling us to keep holding on." They stood there for a while, the wind brushing against their faces, the silence filled with something sacred. Then Ethan spoke again, his tone softer this time. "Grandpa said you don't have to be sad anymore, Grandma. He said love doesn't leave, it just changes." Margaret knelt down beside him, brushing his hair back. "He's a very wise man," she whispered, "and you're a very special boy." That night, back at the cabin, the mood was calm and tender. Rachel helped Margaret with dinner, the two women moving quietly around each other. Their rhythm natural, easy. "I owe you an apology," Rachel said suddenly, "for worrying you. I know what it looked like disappearing like that." Margaret turned to her, her expression kind. "You don't owe me anything. I just wanted you to find your way back to yourself and to them." Rachel nodded, her eyes glistening. "I almost didn't. I was so lost, Margaret. I kept thinking I wasn't enough. Not a good mother, not a good wife. I thought they'd be better off without me." Margaret set down the dish towel and took Rachel's hand. "Listen to me, dear. No one who loves as deeply as you do is ever not enough. You are tired, not broken. Sometimes people just need to step away to remember who they are." Rachel smiled faintly, wiping a tear. "You sound like you've been there." Margaret nodded slowly. "After my husband passed, I spent months feeling like half a person. I thought love was over for me. But one day I realized love doesn't end with loss. It becomes something quieter, something that guides you through." Rachel's eyes softened. "Maybe that's what I need to learn, that love can survive even after we break a little." That evening, David joined them at the table, his demeanor lighter. Over dinner, he and Rachel talked more openly. They laughed about old stories, the time Ethan flooded the kitchen trying to wash his toy car. Or when Rachel burned dinner and they ordered pizza instead. The tension that had haunted them began to dissolve, replaced by small, tender laughter that felt real again. After dinner, Ethan insisted they all sit by the fire. "I want to tell stories," he said excitedly. Margaret smiled. "You first, then." Ethan thought for a moment. "Okay. Once upon a time there was a family that forgot how to laugh. But then they went to a cabin in the woods and they remembered again." He grinned, proud of himself. The end. Rachel hugged him tightly. "That's a beautiful story," she said softly. As the night grew quieter, Rachel stepped outside alone for a moment. The air was crisp, the stars scattered like silver dust across the dark sky. David followed her after a few minutes, standing beside her without saying a word. Finally, she spoke. "I was afraid you wouldn't want me back." He looked at her, his expression gentle. "I was afraid I'd already lost you." They stood there, the cold air biting their skin, but something warm and unspoken passed between them. "I don't know how to fix everything," Rachel whispered. David smiled faintly. "Then let's not fix it all at once. Let's just start with being here together." She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I can do that." Inside, Margaret watched them from the window. She didn't need to hear the words. The way they stood close said enough. She turned back to Ethan, who had fallen asleep on the couch, his little hand still clutching the corner of his blanket. She brushed a strand of hair from his face and whispered, "You were right, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay." The next morning, the cabin felt alive again. Music played softly from David's phone, and Rachel hummed along as she made pancakes. Ethan danced clumsily in his pajamas while Margaret laughed. The sunlight poured through the windows, touching every corner of the house that had once felt cold. When it was time to leave, Ethan looked out at the cabin with a wistful smile. "Can we come back again, Grandma?" he asked. Margaret smiled warmly. "Of course, darling. Maybe next winter." David came over and hugged his mother. "Thank you," he said quietly. She looked up at him. "For what?" "For holding us together when we were falling apart," he said. Her eyes softened. "That's what mothers do, dear. We don't let go even when it hurts." Rachel joined them, her arm around Ethan. "Thank you for believing in us," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Margaret smiled, her heart full. "I didn't need to believe in you," she said softly. "I just needed to remind you to believe in each other." They packed the car, the sound of the trunk closing echoing through the crisp air. Before getting in, Ethan ran back and hugged Margaret tightly. "Grandma," he said, looking up with his bright blue eyes, "I think Grandpa was right." She knelt down, smiling. "About what?" He grinned. "Love doesn't leave. It just changes." Her throat tightened. "That's right, my sweet boy. It always finds a way back." As the car drove away, Margaret stood on the porch, watching until the taillights disappeared down the snowy road. The wind rustled softly through the trees, and for a moment, she could almost hear her husband's voice. Calm, reassuring, proud. When she went back inside, she looked around the quiet cabin. The chairs were still warm, the fire just embers, the scent of pancakes still in the air. She smiled, feeling peace for the first time in years. Love, she realized, wasn't about perfection or promises that never break. It was about showing up again and again, even after the storms. She sat by the window with her cup of tea, the sun rising over the lake. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear laughter echoing faintly. Her family's laughter, carried on the wind like a promise that life, no matter how hard, always gives you another chance to start again.